Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Brill with SOE Software, and I thank you for the opportunity to present testimony here today. This is a special day, not only that I have an opportunity to share with you some of my experiences and things that I've witnessed in my 15 years of professional politics, but also that you've chosen to be here at the University of Miami. As a proud alum of the U, thank you for being here. I just wanted to reiterate some of the things that have been said earlier today about technology. And there are many pieces of technology to address the charges given to you in the presidential order. The training and management of poll workers needs to reflect the complex environment in which our elections must operate. Dwindling government resources means that it means that it becomes even more difficult to gather poll workers together, print and distribute training material, maintain the same quality of training throughout multiple lessons. Again, the application of technology through the use of online training to augment the legacy training programs and management tools to track and provide poll workers over multiple election cycles can reduce the human errors that plague our current process. Clearly, there is a better way. In Don Draper's office, there were typewriters and mimeographs. In our homes, we used to have record players or VHS machines. What do all these things have in common? They're single-use machines. There are a few other places today where single-use machines are in place, except for polling places. The technology of voting is grounded in good, solid 1980s technology. The security provided by today's virus protection, secure socket layer, military-grade encryption, and digital signatures provide security well beyond that of the U.S. Postal Service, a corner mailbox, visual signature verification for the processing of absentee ballots. If we take the not very bold step of emulating countries like Norway or Estonia, we could fill our polling places with commercial off-the-shelf computers and vote online. And if you are deployed, away from home, can't take time off work, or do not want to stand in line in the Miami heat for many hours, your polling place is as far away as the nearest internet connection, which could even be your smartphone. I'm not saying that Ms. Victor would have voted online, but maybe many of the people in front of her would have done so. And to Supervisor Lux's comment earlier today, online voting, his pilot program that we participated in, was a good proof of concept that clearly there is a better way. The statistics that Professor Pursley shared in Washington, D.C. last week were stunning. 17% of active duty military absentee voters never received their requested ballots. That's shameful to disenfranchise such a large percent of Americans who are fighting to protect our freedoms and the right to vote. Additionally, his slide depicting the pitfalls of voting by mail was shocking, but all too true. Technology today can avoid many of those pitfalls. Solutions like secure online voting, which is currently used regularly in 16 countries around the world, can avoid many of these pitfalls. And electronic balloting, delivery, and return, as we've talked about earlier, like the system used in Alaska, mitigates nearly half of the reasons from Professor Pursley's slide. The bottom line is that the system is fraught with potential disenfranchisement, and there are technological tools to ensure that voters' votes are received and counted as intended. So clearly, there is a better way. Thank you.
Thank you. John Camp.
Good afternoon. My name is John Camp. I'm a shareholder with the law firm of Carlton Fields here in Miami and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and give this testimony. Since 2004, I've helped coordinate the Lawyers Committee's election protection program in Florida generally and in Miami-Dade County specifically. The mission of the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition is to ensure that all qualified voters have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process. My comments today are going to be limited to our experience in Miami-Dade County, which is the one that I specifically worked in on Election Day. In addition to the Lawyers Committee's national hotline, leading up to and on the day of the election, we had volunteer lawyers throughout Miami-Dade County assisting voters, addressing problems, systemic and individual, documenting problems to be addressed post-election, and during early voting. Our volunteer lawyers spent time at more than 80 precincts, totaling more than 180,000 registered voters on Election Day, and we had volunteers working at early voting sites throughout Miami-Dade County during early voting. Most of the populations served by the precincts we covered are minority populations in Miami-Dade County: Hispanic, Haitian American, and African American. In addition to those volunteers we had specifically assigned to polling places throughout the county, we had, for want of a better term, a flying column of volunteer lawyers who responded to calls to the hotline at various polling places throughout the county. And so we had pretty broad coverage, albeit with limited resources, on the day of the election. In the run-up to the election, we worked closely with the Miami-Dade County Supervisor of Elections Office to address concerns that they had, to help them monitor their poll worker training and give feedback on that. And I will say that we enjoyed a great relationship with them. And for the record, I would say the Supervisor's Office did yeoman's work, both leading up to the election and on the day of the election. And they were overwhelmed by circumstances, in some ways within their control and in other ways beyond their control due to a lack of resources. And again, I would also comment, because there has been a lot said about poll workers and poll worker training, and I will say that while most of that is accurate, these poll workers, from our observations, worked really long days and long hours and did the best they could with limited training to assist voters in voting. And they weren't always successful, but it wasn't for lack of trying from our observations. I was prepared to address certain points that are in the Lawyers Committee's recommendations and case studies, which have already been submitted to the Commission and are part of the record. And if you haven't read it, I have a copy here for anyone who wants to read it on the way home, but it is available online as well on the Commission's website. But instead of tracking those, which are, as I said, part of the record, I would like to instead address 4 points that were made earlier in the proceedings today, with which I take issue and which I'd like to clear the record up on. First, a comment was made comparing people's willingness to wait several hours for a ride at Disney World to their unwillingness to wait 45 minutes to vote. I would posit that that's not an apt comparison. We have a family on vacation whose sole function is to wait in line to go on rides at Disney World, compared to people who are taking time away from their families and work in order to cast a ballot. And I would also take exception to the notion that the wait was 45 minutes. As you've heard countless times in Miami-Dade County, that was certainly not the case, and I think most voters would have been overjoyed only to have had to wait 45 minutes. On the last Saturday of early voting, I spent several hours at the North Miami Library, one of the early voting sites about which you've heard plenty. I interviewed voters as they were coming out. One couple that came out after casting their ballot told me that they started timing the wait when they got in line, and from the time they got in line to the time they cast their ballots was 8 hours and 15 minutes. And that was typical of voters at that polling place. While I was there, I commented that I'm not sure I would have waited 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. And a Haitian American gentleman who was in line said, you know, I left my family and everything I have, excuse me, and risked everything I have to come to the United States. So waiting in line to vote is nothing. That's a noble sentiment, but I don't think it's something that we should have to endure. To wait 8 hours to vote is ridiculous. The second comment was made about people's willingness to wait, about waiting to the last minute to vote. And it's clear that in Miami-Dade County, in any event, it wasn't because people waited to the last minute to vote that they had to wait long hours. In fact, throughout early voting, the waits were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours or more. And on Election Day, those long lines began at 7 a.m. and persisted long into the night. And as was previously mentioned by one of the people making comments, many of those people were still in line waiting to cast their ballots long after the election was called. I would also say that I agree with remarks that were made about various other factors contributing to the long wait lines and the log jams that were created in the polling places once voters got in. And those have been documented, and they're also in the materials submitted by the Lawyers Committee, and I would commend those to you. And finally, there was a suggestion that the length and complexity of the ballots was a problem for the voters because they didn't do their homework ahead of time. And I would suggest that I consider myself a fairly educated voter, and I did do my homework ahead of time. I read the ballot. I knew what I was going to vote on all of those. And it nevertheless took me quite a bit of time just to get through it, to make sure I was reading the right ballot provisions, dealing with the right constitutional amendments, et cetera, and then scanning my multi-page ballot into the scanning machine, of which there were very limited at the particular polling place I was in. So I would suggest that while, yes, I agree that voters should take personal responsibility to prepare themselves to vote on Election Day, that the length and complexity of the ballot is not simply something that you can place at the feet of the voters. Thank you.
Thank you. Alma Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, my name is Alma Gonzalez. I serve as special counsel to the President of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees in Florida. In 2012, I also had the privilege and responsibility of serving as the Director of Voter Protection for the AFL-CIO in Florida. We represent hundreds of thousands of employees all over the state of Florida and their families as well. I would suggest to you that nobody has a bigger job than you do. And I appreciate the amount of time and effort and dedication that you're showing us today, and particularly in Florida, given our long legacy of difficulties. I started my advocacy on behalf of voters back when I was not even in grade school, because many individuals in my community were dying in Vietnam and didn't have the right to vote. And so I canvassed neighborhoods with others in high school to make sure that 18-year-olds had the right to vote. Throughout my career, I have worked in Wisconsin doing voter registration, doing campaigns, political campaigns, doing election administration, and now doing voter protection. So I understand what it takes for you to sit where you are today, and I thank you so much for it. I want to start by addressing a question that was asked by the Commission earlier today, and that is, how do you define success in elections, particularly in Florida? And I would say to you that much as we are expected in union elections to show that we have a majority of voters indicating their desire that we be the representative, the exclusive representative, we ought to start with a metric that says at least a majority of eligible voters in a particular state ought to have the right to vote, that they ought to be registered to vote, and that they ought to have the opportunity to vote. In the election administration area where I have worked, we set the following standard for ourselves to define success. We say that in every election that we conduct, that there must be accuracy in the vote, that there must be integrity in the vote, that there must be transparency in the vote. And I would suggest to you that those are three metrics that you ought to utilize in terms of a macro set of how do you define success. Are a majority of people being able to vote? Do they have a confidence in that the fact that their vote is going to be counted so that they can have a voice in their government and a voice in the future? And are the elections being conducted in a way that are accurate, where we have integrity and that we have transparency? I would also suggest that from what we've done, we've worked very closely with our partners at the Lawyers Committee, at the Advancement Project, at the Brennan Center, at the ACLU, at the League of Women Voters. It is one of the things that we have to do in Florida. We all have to come together to make sure that those metrics, accuracy, integrity, transparency, and the opportunity to have a voice in your government and in your future is met. We all have to come together to make it happen. Because in the analysis that we do, the following things have to be looked at. We have to look at the law. We have to look at leadership. We have to look at legacy, and we have to look at logistics. And we're able to do that. I sat here today listening to some people who I really love and some people who I have less confidence in when I listened to your panel of supervisors of election. One of the wonderful opportunities that I've had in my career was to serve as a lobbyist for the Florida Association of Counties. So I know very well the relationship between boards of county commissioners and constitutionally elected officers like supervisors of elections. And I know what it takes to be able to be in that situation where you have to liaise between people who have the money and between the people who make the law that tell you what it is to do your job. So let me start with the law. I want to reiterate the comments of the League of Women Voters today with regard to how difficult your task is as a result of the terrible, grievous decision that the Supreme Court has rendered in Shelby. Without that tool, we are unable to cover the people we need to cover. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund has stated that 15 million Latino Hispanic voters will be affected by that decision. 32% of Latino Hispanic voters live in Section 5 counties, jurisdictions. That's a problem for us. It's a big problem for us in Florida. There are 5 pre-clearance counties in Florida, and now it just doesn't matter what they do. And when you look at counties like the supervisor of elections in Collier County, who purged voters despite the fact that even the governor had backed away from the purge list, you know why. That particular section of the Department of the National Voter Rights Act is critical to us in Florida. When you look at situations like the fact that the Elections Administration Commission at the federal government has not been active at all, it complicates your job. And we need to make sure that those kinds of things are addressed. But I want to also talk about terrible laws like House Bill 1355, which we tried to get repealed and had to fight. The new law, House Bill 7013, that pretended to fix some of the problems and only exacerbated some of them. I want to tell you that unless we deal with constitutional matters that have already been addressed to you today, we're going to continue to have a problem, because when you start with a law that doesn't work, that allows voter suppression, there is nowhere for those supervisors of elections to go. But even those supervisors of election have the responsibility to show leadership. And there are supervisors that do that. Dr. Snipes, my good friend Ion Sancho in Leon County, they know how to build coalition. They know how to come to the community. But then there are others who think that voting is a privilege. And we have faced those people time and time again. There is a metric that we will be providing to you that we developed as a coalition long ago that gives us a scorecard in terms of how those supervisors of elections can perform. How many pollsters have they? How many poll monitors do they have? How many folks, how many precincts do they have? Have they switched things around? How much money are they putting into it? And I don't disagree that more resource helps, but I tell you what, when I go and talk to a supervisor of elections who's putting out fans with her face on it, with their money in terms of the just scarce resource that we have in terms of voter education, I don't have confidence in that supervisor of elections, and nobody should. Nobody should, because it politicizes elections to the extent that we're not able to make sure that there's the confidence of the voters. I've said to you that the logistics, are things that we have to look at, and we'll talk all day long about, fix this and, open more queuing and those sorts of things. That's all logistics. Logistics are the easy part. The legacy, though, is what we need to worry about. And the legacy depends upon our ability to collect data so that we can have metrics that are objective. And there is nothing in the law right now that requires us to have that kind of legacy. But I also want to leave you with the thought about the legacy that matters the most. I joined my colleague from Carlton Fields, who was offended by a supervisor of elections statement that people waited until the last minute as if they were like, oh, we just want to see if we can wait until the last minute. The fact of the matter is that some of those people have a legacy of voting that their parents died for. And voting on election day itself is a legacy to them. It means something. It is iconic. It's an important moment for them. And let's not belittle that, because it makes no sense for us to do that. It makes no sense for us to belittle that. We are, I think, able to address the issues that are before you. We do not want to continue to be some joke, the butt of a joke on the Jay Leno monologue. We want to get this right. And the people in Florida showed and demonstrated in 2012 by their willingness to stand hour after hour after hour in a line to be able to cast their vote that they care about this. I want to also suggest to you, because someone asked, how long is too long to wait? I negotiate contracts for people every day. Employers say to me, you know what, Alma, I'm going to give your people, when I have a good employer, okay, so sometimes I don't have a good employer. When I have a good, wonderful employer, they say to me, Alma, I'm going to give your folks an hour to vote. So I'm going to suggest that one objective measure that you want to utilize is the amount of time that an employer is willing to give my people to vote is the amount of time that supervisors of elections ought to be able to clear a line. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Lori Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair. I'm encouraged that you're taking the time to hear from the public here today. And you know what I'm excited about? I'm delighted about the composition of this commission. The diverse expertise that you are bringing is sure to result in synapses and cross-pollination that's rarely available to election administrators. I'm Lori Edwards. I'm the Supervisor of Elections from Polk County, Florida, and I'm the President of the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections. I've been in election administration for 12 years, and before that, I was in the Florida legislature. I hold state and national certification in election administration, and I love my job. I'm happy today, though, to bring your attention to what is my biggest concern, and that's voting equipment. While I feel strongly that election administrators should not be early adapters, we really need tried and true technology. If anybody needs tried and true technology, it's us. Innovation in this field is definitely being stifled. You're probably aware that the United States Election Assistance Commission develops voluntary voting system guidelines for manufacturers, and prudent election officials are rightly hesitant to spend millions of dollars, as well as the public's trust, on equipment that doesn't comply with those voluntary standards. But once again, and the most important point that I would like to bring today, is a reminder that the standards that are currently in effect are the 2006 standards. 2006, 7 years ago. 7 years ago, there were no iPhones. 7 years ago, there were no iPads. 7 years ago, our computers were running Windows XP. The worst part, I don't see any progress. I see no progress at all. This bureaucracy is stifling innovation and it's killing competition, and the voters are going to pay. You probably know the rule of thumb for election equipment, the lifespan, 10 to 12 years, usually about 10 years. That means all of the jurisdictions across the nation who bought new equipment following that very controversial, I hate to bring it up, in Florida especially, the very controversial 2000 presidential election, they're now overdue for equipment. And the equipment they'll be choosing, it's going to be antiquated by technology standards. As you develop your recommendation on this topic as well as others, I'd like to offer a suggestion, and that is please resist the temptation of centralization and uniformity. Uniformity is by nature slow to progress. And I believe decentralization of our elections is the single biggest factor that keeps us safe from fraud. We haven't heard about fraud much today, but heaven knows a year or two ago we heard a lot about potential fraud. It would take cooperation to taint an election. We have 800,000 poll workers across the nation on Election Day at 200,000 precincts. Think about it. Now, have you ever been to Disney World with maybe 5 or 6 people? Can you get them to even agree that it's time to eat lunch? It's just about impossible, right? That same dynamic is what keeps us from an organized effort to tamper with elections. There's just no way you're going to get enough people to agree and get into cahoots to tamper with an election. And I really believe that decentralization is underappreciated as a source of fighting fraud in elections. And finally, I wanted to tell you that I draw encouragement as I sat here today of this table of resources that we have assembled to improve our elections following the concern after the 2012 election. And you know what? We're not here because people were denied the right to vote. And we're not here because of widespread fraud. And we're not here because the technology failed. And we're not here because we lost a bunch of votes. We're here because people had to stand in some long lines. Some people had to stand in long lines. Definitely an inconvenience, but what a country. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana Farmer.
Hi, I'm Dana Farmer from Disability Rights Florida, and I wanted to thank you for letting me talk to you today. Our agency is a designated protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities in Florida. And there's an agency like ours in every state and every possession, and we're largely federally funded. We have a grant through HAVA, which is Protection and Advocacy for Voting Access. I'm going to be talking to you today about accessibility for persons with disabilities. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about is the voter registration of people with disabilities. Section 7 of the National Voter Registration Act was created to enhance voting opportunities and to increase historically lower voter registration rates, including those of persons with disabilities. And this is a section that specifies voter registration opportunities must be offered through all offices that provide state-funded programs engaged in providing services to people with disabilities. So if you go to an agency that provides these state-funded services, at the time that you enroll, at the time that you're recertified, at the time you change your address, you're always supposed to be offered the opportunity to vote. Not only are you supposed to be offered it while you're in the office, but if you receive your services at home, you're supposed to be offered that opportunity at home as well. The Act also requires that you receive the same degree of assistance in filling out those forms that you would get in filling out the agency forms. So that's kind of the story there. And the agencies that fail to comply with this face possible federal audits, withholding of federal funds, and fines by the Federal Election Commission. So why am I talking about this today? And the problem is the enrollment is just really abysmal. And figures that came out this week from the Elections Assistance Commission, through this process in Florida in 2011-2012, 763 people were enrolled. When you think about the number of people with disabilities who receive services that are state-funded in Florida, it's just kind of mind-boggling to me. So what this says to me is that there's something going on here that's wrong. And what's going on, one thing, is that in many states in the past, services to people with disabilities were provided by state agencies themselves. What's going on now in many states, and Florida is a big example of this, is lots of those services are now contracted out to managing entities, to all types of providers. And in talking with the providers about this, how come they're not registering their people, what I learned just across the board was that the providers of these contracted services had no idea that they had this obligation to enroll their folks. I've talked to provider groups that are extremely interested in doing this voter registration. We're working now with Secretary Dinster and his folks to enhance their education and outreach that can be used with these provider associations. It's the easiest way to get at groups of providers is through an association. And what we're also ourselves going out and doing education to providers about how to do the enrollment, making them aware of the obligation. The supervisors in all the counties could be doing this outreach to their local entities as well. And that's a recommendation that we have. Another recommendation is that the state, when they contract out these services, they really need to put that in the contracts that go to these providers, and they need to have performance measurements for that as well. So I really think that it's kind of just a real travesty that these numbers are so low. And with not a whole lot of work, we could get them up. The other thing I wanted to talk to you today are the accommodations for people with disabilities and elders and the lines. Everybody's talked about the lines today. We were part of a group doing a national voter protection hotline, and some of the calls for people with disabilities were forwarded to our office. And kind of what we were getting was for both early voting and election day, people were not aware of what the policies at any particular county or precinct might be about accommodations. What we found out, kind of just because people told us afterwards, that if you were a person with a visible disability, meaning a wheelchair, oxygen tank, any of those kinds of things, poll workers that were outside were more likely to tell you, hey, you can get a number, or you've got chairs up front, or something like that, so you'd know what you would do about the lines. If you were people who did not have visible disabilities, it was just really hit and miss if you found this out at all. So another problem that was going on was that, if you're a person with a disability who uses handicap parking and you're stuck in line for a long time, the handicap parking never turns over. So people drive up, the parking's full, and they just go on. Maybe they'll come back later. Several people tried multiple times. Some states have actually developed statewide options for people with disabilities who need accommodations at the polls, and those are in the written comments that are provided to you. So here's our recommendations about that. That the supervisors develop policies specific to voters with disabilities, elders who are unable to stand in line to cast a ballot. That you publicize these policies in advance at the time that and plenty of times so absentee ballots can be requested. One of the things that if voters knew in advance what accommodations would be available for voting in person, they can make a more informed decision about if they wanted to vote by mail or vote in person. And then the other thing was people need to know what to do when they get there if they do need an accommodation, particularly if they don't have a visible disability. There should be signage telling them what to do and who to ask for assistance. Thank you very much.